How do we cherish the present while preparing for the inevitable? How do we navigate a grief that doesn't come with closure? These are some of the tough questions we're talking about today. And joining us is Dr. Theresa B. Skaar, or as many know her as Dr. T, with a PhD in social psychology, expert in mind-body medicine, and a certification in mindfulness-based stress reduction. Dr. T is deeply committed to helping people, particularly caregivers, find peace and resilience in the most challenging moments of life. She brings a wealth of experience from her personal caregiving as well as her professional work in workshops where she blends humor, compassion, and practical tools. Whether you're a caregiver or someone interested in learning how mindfulness and grief intersect, Dr. T's insights will leave you feeling both comforted and empowered. In today's conversation, we'll explore what it means to experience anticipatory and ambiguous grief, why it matters to understand this type of grief, and how mindfulness can be a powerful tool in your process. Here is my interview with Dr. T. I've got with me today Dr. Theresa Skaar, who I had the pleasure of seeing from across the room. We didn't get quite to meet. We're both in Minnesota, but welcome. I'm so happy that we're able to have this conversation today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nicole. I admire your work. And when I found out you too were in Minnesota, I was like, yay, like this is amazing. And especially with the things that we talk about and are so passionate about. So thank
Right.
you.
Oh, yes, it's such a joy. And it's so true. Our work and our passions do really intersect in a lot of different ways.
Yes.
So we were saying how awesome we get to like tell people about each other, and being in
Yes,
Minneapolis, that makes it, yeah, so fun to see the community that's here.
absolutely.
It does. Well, today we're going to talk about anticipatory, ambiguous grief, all around all of that. And I know we're going to get into even deeper conversation in that sector. But first, I would love to hear, because I don't know all this detail yet. How did your journey into psychology, mindfulness, grief support, all that you're up to? I'd love to hear what brought you to that
Oh,
place.
thank you. It is a very windy path, Nicole. Like it is. I never would have thought that I would have been sitting here in this moment, and I'm thrilled that I am. So when I was younger, my first career was as a nursing assistant. I worked at
Mm,
Shalom Home, which was by the state fair, and I worked with a lot of different like care levels. My first foray into nursing, or nursing assisting, was at another place. I'm blanking on the name, but that's who trained me. And I remember it was an early shift. And so this woman did not want to get up. And I was like, oh no, of course you sleep, you rest. Like you have made it to this long rest. I didn't want to get up, and I was 18, 19 years old. And then I got in trouble because there was like a list. And I
right.
remember I remember kind of bumping up against that even at an early age, going like, wait, we don't have autonomy, we don't have choice. What? Like
Mm,
and I think things are shifting in that space, but I don't know how much because I haven't actually worked in that world directly. But I know at the time as a late teen, early 20s, I was like, what is happening?
mm,
Why can't we choose? And so fast forward, throughout the years, I was very close with my grandmother and grandma, and I would spend every Thursday with her in the last 10 years of her life. So basically, all the run of Friends, because
mm.
Friends was on the TV series Friends was on Thursdays, and we watched every Thursday. And so we did that for about 10 years prior to her passing. And that was just a gift. Like, we'd hang out, we'd eat dinner together. And it was this closeness that I got to have then intergenerationally, which I think is so important. And I'm just going to fast forward, like some people don't have
Mhm.
that opportunity. And so
Right.
I now belatedly go like, wow, that was really unique and special. And so we spent most Thursdays together. When I married my husband, he was always really close with his grandpa Jimmy. I call him Grandpa Jimmy now too. But we would go and make Italian sausage at his house with a secret, top secret family recipe,
Oh, that's so
top secret.
cool.
Well, we have shared it now since he's passed, but at the time, he wouldn't even give his sister the recipe.
Wow, it was
And
protected.
it was so protected. So we would go and we'd make cases of Italian sausage and, he'd sell it to people. And then I remember the day that I got to see the recipe. And I
Mm.
said to Grandpa Jimmy, I was like, oh, I feel more like a part of the family than my wedding day. And Charlie's my husband. He's like, hey. And I'm like, hey, like his
That's a
sister
big
doesn't
deal.
know the recipe and I do. So there was that personal aspect where I was interacting with the older adults in my life and having these great opportunities to have conversations, especially at the end of their life and what they were thinking about, that next stage that we often avoid, which is, death. And, that's the next big milestone. But we kind of like, oh, no, you're going to live forever, which actually you're not. And that doesn't really honor maybe their experience. So I was able to have some really powerful conversations, like with my grandma. I remember asking her one time if she had any regrets. And she was like, oh, Terry. And she's the only one that calls me Terry.
Mhm.
But she was like, oh, Terry. She's like, yeah, I know I hurt some people, but boy, did I have fun. And so she had regrets for hurting people, but then she had had this kind of joyful connection with life. So that was something I was then able to share with family after she passed. I don't know if that gave any ease, but it was my hope that it would. And then with Grandpa Jimmy, and okay, diehard Catholic, so Italian,
Yeah.
gave to the church, ushered every weekend. And I was sitting bedside with him and I said to him, are you looking forward to seeing Elma, which was his wife who had passed about 12 years earlier. And he goes, Therese, he called me Therese, Therese, that's what they want you to believe. And I go, wait, what? You are so close to finding out. And he's like, that's what they want you to believe. And I
Oh,
thought, and he goes,
isn't
it'd be
that
nice.
lovely?
And
Yeah.
so I thought, to slow down and actually have conversations and saying, like, are you worried? Are you afraid? Are you? So anyway, so that was a personal,
Mhm.
powerful examples. I was during that time working in engineering. I was not in as an engineer. I wore many hats. I was a marketing assistant. I was an executive assistant. I was office managery-esque. I was an HR rep. And so I worked there for a number of years. And before that, I worked in insurance as a claims adjuster. So again, this windy kind of bumping around path. I never finished my undergrad. And so, but I would take classes here and there. And in 2008, 2009, I was working for a different company and I was miserable and cried almost every day at
Oh
lunch.
no.
It was brutal. But then they kept having these closed door meetings and of course economic downturn. And I would just stare at my boss's doors and I'd be like, lay me off, off.
Yeah.
And they did. And
Ah!
so I have like the benefit of like a different story. I know a lot of people don't have that story, but
Mm.
for me, I couldn't see my way out. I was exhausted, I was miserable. And when I got laid off, then because I was over four, or was I 40 yet? It doesn't matter. Almost 40, then I was in that protected class or whatever. And so I was able to go back to school. And my husband's super supportive. He's like, yeah. And so I got to be a full-time college student in my late 30s, early 40s. Like I graduated from my undergrad when I was 41.
Wow. I
Yeah. And so
love that you did
I
that.
I do too. I mean, I was like, could not believe how fortunate I was because not a lot of people have that experience. You're busy trying to take, as I knew from all my decades earlier, trying to take a class here and there and get distracted and life
Mhm.
turns up. But then I got hired back to the engineering firm that I worked at as a project accountant, which not a good fit, not my jam.
Yeah.
But I was like, I'm working with people I care about. It's
Mhm.
familiar. I'm so happy to have this, and I have my degree. While I was at school, so I went to Metro State
Mhm.
to finish my degree, and I met my then advisor, then mentor, and now friend, Carrie Clayman, and she kept saying to me, we'd meet for breakfast and she'd say, what about grad school? I'm like, are you cracked? Like I just
Right.
got
I
my
just
undergrad.
completed
Like,
that.
yeah, well, and I never thought I'd get my undergrad. So the gift of, so it just was, and no one in my sister and I think are the only ones in our family that had gone to college. Maybe my
Mhm.
cousin did. And not that that matters, but we didn't have any examples. We didn't have any, like, here's the road. So when Carrie kept saying that, things had shifted at work, my hours got cut, blah, blah, blah. And because of other finances and with the company. And so then I said to Charlie, we were driving up to his parents' cabin, and I was like, what do you think about grad school? Like, what, like, this is weird. Like, is this oh, and I'm a twin, and my twin is the smart one. So, and
Oh,
I was the social one. So also like kind of shifting that role
yeah.
as well. But and he said, think about your bookcase. And, you can see some of my books back here behind me. And he's like, would you want to get paid for what you do for free already? And I was like,
Mm.
well, when you put it that way.
Mhm.
And he talked about how miserable I had been, and he was like, hey, the time that you were with that other firm when you were crying every day, and just
Mhm.
most recently, it's been really a struggle. You don't want to go. He goes, would you want to take 5 years out of, kind of your career path? And it was 7, but 5 years out to get your degree, and then do something that you're passionate about, share things that you're passionate about, or do you want to kind of slog and do a hard 20 till you can
Mhm.
retire? And I mean, when he said it that way, and he works for a company that allowed him to work remote before remote working really was common. And so we were able to pick up and move. Neither one of us had ever lived anywhere but Minnesota. And so we hightailed it out to Reno, where I had gotten accepted into the social psychology program, interdisciplinary social psychology PhD. It's a mouthful. And
Mhm.
sometimes I still am like, how did that happen? Because it is a rigorous program, but
What
I
an
think it's one of those
adventure.
like divine timing, divine, I
Yeah.
mean, whatever, I'm woo adjacent, but
Mhm.
so like it just felt like the
Mhm.
doors were opening, like this path was unfolding.
Yeah.
And then that leads me to meditation, because while I was there, my first year, so again, I'm 44, had never lived anywhere but Minnesota. You don't leave Minnesota usually
It's
in your
so true.
40s.
Yeah.
You usually come back home,
Yeah.
come back and settle down. And so leaving, trying to figure out grocery stores, plus
Mm.
the rigor um, of grad school, I everything went off the rails. Like my sugar intake, my alcohol went in consumption went up.
Mhm.
I was like stressed and crying. And and so I was talking about this at work. I worked for the Sanford Center for Aging. So I actually worked for an
Mm.
organization all throughout grad school and then post grad, for an organization called the Sanford Center for Aging. So very much like the emphasis on the for.
Yeah.
And I was talking to my friend Heather, and I was like, I'm just so stressed. I'm so stressed. And she's like, have you thought about meditation? And I was like, oh, I will try anything. Like I will like
Yeah.
anything. Which then I think someone had sent me the link, my friend Emily, and within 11 minutes, I had signed up for my first mindfulness-based stress reduction course, which is an 8-week course. That, Nicole, changed my life so much that I then concurrently, while getting my PhD, got trained to facilitate mindfulness-based stress reduction. And then fast forward, was invited onto a grant to learn and be certified in mind-body skills through the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. And so that, because it changed my life. So now mindfulness is woven into everything,
Mhm.
every aspect of what I do, what I teach, how I am, because it didn't, as I like to say, it didn't take away my stress, but it really did shift how I related to it, which was just powerful. So
Yeah.
that is a very, I was like, oh my
Ah,
gosh, that was a long answer
no.
to that
Uh,
question,
so
but
fascinating, though.
yeah,
I
yeah,
love
and
it.
thank
So many
you.
details bring us to where we are, right? It
Right?
all
And
it
it's
all comes
never
together.
alone. Like I
Right.
never think of that as an autonomous event,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
I often, when I say my PhD, I usually say our, because Charlie was right there in the trenches
Hmm.
drying my
Hmm.
tears. Oh, and then
Hmm.
to which I learned. So we know each other through Katie and the Let's Talk Women.
Yeah.
But I went to a fireside chat led by one of the panelists from the Joyful Aging. And I learned in there that I was in perimenopause and that there were a lot of symptoms that really I had kept attributing to
Oh,
grad school, but I might have been able to get help.
right.
So now I'm passionate about saying to people like, okay, because I mean, I was up in the middle of the night, I was
Yeah.
anxious, I was crying.
Oh
And
my
then, so
God.
as I was
Yeah.
sitting at this fireside chat and people are talking about their symptoms, I was like,
Is that, is
holy
that,
schmoly,
yeah.
that's me. I mean, yes, grad school is hard, but I kept thinking, why
Um,
is it so extra hard? Is it because I'm an
mm,
older student and everyone in my cohort is younger? Yeah, it was
oh
amazing.
my gosh, the things we learn. And I agree at this time of life, and there's so much more conversation around perimenopause and
Yes.
menopause, and where a lot of times all of that would be dismissed as maybe mental health issues.
Yes.
Now there's the recognition of actually there's so much going on. It's hormonal.
Right.
Why are we not talking about this more? So
Yes.
I'm so glad that
Yes.
yeah, that they're doing that. We
Same.
both started when I was in college, I worked as a registered nursing
Oh,
assistant.
did you?
Yeah, at the time, I don't know if it's still called, it was New Brighton Care Center.
Okay.
That is, yeah. And I had the same experience. I had, 12 people, 10 to 12 people on
Yes.
my sheet of paper. And
Yes.
you had, a lot of responsibilities within that. But yeah, I think we're moving more in that direct, not I think, I know we're moving more in that direction of
hmm
we like to use the term person-centered care where there's more
Yes.
preference being honored, which I'm so happy to see that because, yeah, the poor person that has to get up first, it's like that is a really early morning
You're
or a
right.
really late night. And so, yeah, having
Absolutely.
preference in that. And I love that you incorporate the mindfulness piece, specifically as a caregiver,
Mm.
there's so much that, we're navigating not only emotionally, physically,
Yes.
but we need those tools to support us. We need those tools.
Yes.
And grief is a piece of that. It's like, how do we not only set ourselves up for peace and success, or at least support while
Yes.
we're in our caregiving, but also after? And I know there's a term that we have talked about called anticipatory grief.
Yes.
It differs from the grief that we experience after a loss.
hmm
How would you describe that? What does that mean when we say that term? Um,
Yeah, and that
yeah.
was something again with my like personal journey. I was able to
Mhm.
look back and go like, oh, that's what that term is. And so that's why I really like to bring it up and share that with people. So, anticipatory grief is you are anticipating the grief of this person who you are close to and their
Mhm.
passing.
Mhm.
And I did that for a number of years with my grandma. Anytime she'd go in the hospital, crying, and I'd be like, okay, I'm preparing. And then I was devastatedly shocked to know that none of that anticipatory grief, like was inoculated me from the real grief at the
Right,
when it really happened.
right.
So it's anticipating, it's looking at this person. It might be thinking like, what's my life going to be without them, and how am I going to do this? And I know a lot of people, and you might see these memes where people are talking about their pets this way, and they're like, one person I just saw recently, it's been 0 days since I cried, real tear, or like cried
Yeah.
deeply over the loss of my dog, who is a healthy 2-year old. Like, so,
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
we look at these beings and we know for sure, like with humans, we
Mhm.
don't really, there's a lot of, we don't really know when people are going to
Mhm.
pass, but with dogs, you pretty much know you've signed up
Right,
for a shorter lifespan, usually than
right.
your own. And so I think that people are feeling this and they're expressing it in reels or in TikToks, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's anticipatory grief because you're imagining your life without this person,
Yeah.
which is it. It can be painful, and so and that's where the mindfulness comes in, right? So
Mhm.
I think it's like acknowledging, like, oh, like this hurts right
Mhm.
now that I am feeling this way, but to also not let yourself get caught in the rumination cycle where
Mm,
you can't even be present to the joys of this moment, because
right.
the joys in this moment are so, they can be fleeting, but they can be really powerful. But you have to be in that moment. And my godmother, I loved her Aunt Pat, and she would say to me, she'd be like, "Oh, like we haven't seen you in for so long," and there'd be all this guilt, and I'm like, "But I'm here now. Can we just be here now?" And so, that's not anticipatory grief, but it's also just that little reminder of like, when we're with someone, can we be present, but also honor that those very real feelings? Because not understanding that, you might be again like attributing it to like a mental health issue or
Right.
something like that, when it's like, no, this is real.
Yeah.
And having compassion for your experience, and
Mhm.
seeking help if you can't get out of the rumination loop by yourself.
Right, right. Oh,
Yeah.
that's such a good reminder. And when you talk about, I love that you talk about that not the opposite of like we have anticipatory grief, but then the antidote to that is cherishing the present, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
how do we as caregivers like practically do that? While we're
Yeah.
managing our
Yes. Yes.
anticipatory grief. I know, the ruminating is such a real thing where you
Yeah.
get stuck in this loop of, well, what's going to happen? How will that feel when I actually
Yes.
experience that loss?
Hmm.
And yeah, there's just so many thoughts that go into that.
Yeah, so there's gifts of the anticipatory grief, because you might actually come up to like real life things like, I
Mhm,
don't know where the life insurance policy information is.
mhm.
Or, as when my, Aunt Pat died, my Uncle Kenny didn't know where the mailbox was or something. There was something on that order. I remember him not knowing something about their home. So anticipatory grief could wake you up to going like, oh, what do I do? Let's get these things answered.
Mm,
So you can use that proactively as well, and offering yourself compassion, but in the moment. So caregiver grief is so entwined, and I'm specifically talking about when you're caring for a family member
yeah.
or a loved one that you're close with. So not necessarily in the professional category, although that is worth talking about, but in
Mhm,
this moment, because then there's the mix of roles, right? So I am finding myself as a care partner, but really all I want to do is be a daughter or a son or a husband or a wife. And so there's grief with that too. So there's a real role change when you are in the moment, and there is, things coming at you, and there's logistics, and there is, physical care, there's grief, loss of who that person was, maybe their mental capacity or their physical capacity loss,
mhm,
for what you were hoping for. But in all of that swirly whirly stuff, it is that moment of bringing your attention to your feet on the ground,
mm,
feeling like pausing, taking 2 or 3 mindful breaths, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. Actually, research shows that it calms your nervous system through the vagus nerve. So it's actually telling your body that you're safe in this moment.
mhm,
So you might
mhm,
not feel safe. Your mind might be like going a million miles an hour, and there might be real challenges and real fear. But in that moment, you might be able to pause. You might be able to say, okay, I'm feeling the air on my skin. I'm feeling my feet on the floor. I'm taking a couple of mindful breaths, or, taking time to, I like using transition times. And this is also great for healthcare workers. But,
mhm,
if you're transitioning from, home to work, if you're transitioning from, you know, cleaning something up in the bathroom, taking a pause, maybe feeling as you're washing your hands, feeling the soap and water on your hands. And just so anytime you can bring yourself to the present moment, and even if it's so fleeting, it'll give your body just that little bit of like, okay, we're safe in this moment. Okay, deep breath, exhale, and then move on. And it's not going to work all of the time. And when it doesn't, then you notice yourself beating yourself up. Why did I say that? Why did I do that? Why did I lose my temper? Then it's, and I'm putting hands to heart center, like putting
mhm,
hands to heart center, or holding your own hands and just giving yourself compassion and saying, this is hard.
mhm,
Because we also have this idea that because it's out of love and it's out of this, that if we complain, then we're somehow not honoring the relationship, or we're being, yeah, I don't know.
Mm,
So there's this weird
true.
mix up too
Yeah.
with like actually just pausing and saying this is hard, or this isn't what I wanted to do, yet I
Mhm.
am making this choice to do this, and this is where we are.
Right.
And and then just acknowledging, and then again, seeking someone outside of maybe the family, or the something that it could be a coach or a therapist, or just a friend that is not feeling that same level of grief and
Mhm.
exhaustion.
Yeah, having the outlet there. I
Yeah.
love that you use the word gifts, the gifts of it, because it
Yeah.
then has us thinking about, well, what are those things do I need to think about or be prepared for, right? Knowing how to incorporate that so that we feel grounded in what
Hmm.
we're doing and what happens.
Yes.
The other side of that is a term called ambiguous grief. And I feel that's not as commonly used, right?
Right.
When we
No.
talk about that, when we talk about grief, what is it? Why is it particularly hard for us?
Well, because it's not really talked about and
Yeah.
acknowledged. I touched on it a little, but I'll expand here with the because it's the roles. It's I have lost my partner. I have lost,
Mhm.
but they're still physically here. Maybe someone is living with dementia, and so you can't have the same conversation. So there's grief there, or maybe there was plans for retirement that you don't get to have because there was a medical condition or a medical happening. And so it's not really talked about, right? It's
Mhm.
so it's ambiguous because it's like, is this grief? I mean, they're still here. And you might
Right.
have well-intended people in your life going, well, at least, so be careful. And I just shook my finger. Be careful when you use well, at least, or
Mhm.
still, because, well, at least you still have your mom. At least you still have your husband. No, 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 no. Like the husband that I had is not the husband that I married. And yes, we make a lot of vows and commitments,
Mhm.
but there's still pain, there's still grief with that loss, or the loss of, I had this kind of not me personally, but
Mhm.
many people have an uncomplicated, loving relationship with their moms. And then all of a sudden they become a care partner, and
Mhm.
they're doing like either helping support physical cares, or they're doing the money and the health and so then they're like, I just wanted to go to lunch like
Right.
with my mom.
Yeah.
And so again, so that's the ambiguous, when you're not really clear on what's happening. And that
Mhm.
can happen through a lot of things. It can happen through loss of a job, loss of a friendship, which we don't talk about, that friendships, when there's loss, that can be really painful. Relationships, so we usually think of grief as the someone died
Mhm.
and you're grieving.
Yeah.
Well, no, there's a lot of little griefs along the way. And so
Yeah.
how can we meet those and say again, like, oh, I see that this is happening.
Mhm.
And then you can offer because without awareness, you can't make any changes.
Right.
So without awareness, you can't say, oh, I need to reach out to a friend, or I want to do some sort of practice that is supporting me in this moment, or wow, it just really sucks that I don't get to have this relationship or that we don't, the dreams unrealized, right? So
Mm.
the dreams of, what could have been, that's really painful, especially when the person's still here, and
Right.
especially when there's well-intended people who try to bolster you with platitudes.
Yeah.
Please
I
stop.
know. I know. Yeah. It lacks that closure. And all of us like to have things wrapped up in a tidy bow,
Yes.
ideally,
Yes.
right? But it's not, it always doesn't play out like that.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, and if you can't
yeah.
name it because you're not thinking about it that way, because then it might be like, oh, well, I'm selfish because I wanted to travel the country in an RV, but now my husband had this, I don't know, stroke or something, that he's
Right.
unable to do that. Well, then it's like, well, yes, yes, I do believe in acknowledging, but I think there's an important grief piece,
Mm,
and then looking and going like, okay, what's possible with what we
right.
have right now?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. We hear that when we are in grief, right,
Mhm.
or stress,
Mhm.
how it can really impact our emotional health, our psychological health. What does that look like? I think sometimes we go, okay, I'm grieving, we'll move past it. It's going to be fine. But I also think it's important to look at if we have, like you were saying,
Mhm.
the awareness of how is this actually really impacting my health so that I know that it's important that I address it or that I acknowledge it in
Yes.
some way.
Yes. I love this question because it is wild. So first of
Mhm.
all, when I started formally researching grief, much of the research says, that you are done grieving in 2 months. Anyone
Mm,
who has ever had an experience of grief, that is not in the reality, but what they mean in the research is that are you back to functioning? Are
mm,
mostly people are returning to work or to no, quote unquote normalcy. They might be able to, they're not stuck in like the deep grief cycle. But so I think that we as, hmm, how do I say this? We're uncomfortable with messy
mm,
emotions. We're
mhm.
uncomfortable with seeing people we love hurting.
Right.
So we want them to be done quicker, right? So
Yeah.
we want them also to be like, okay, like we're good now, right? And so, we especially like that first year, like, okay, we've got through the anniversaries, the birthdays, the holidays.
Mm,
Um, but in my research and what people would share to me, it's often the second and third and so on years that are hardest because people have like, I've attended to you in this first year and it's on my radar. And of course,
mhm.
life is busy. And if it hasn't impacted you, personally, then it is hard to stay that attentive to someone. So
It does.
I think that idea of grief being different for everybody and it is
Mhm.
impacting your physical health. There are, people can experience anxiety which might mimic like heart attack feelings. People
Mhm.
are exhausted. They might not be able to, one woman shared with me that she couldn't leave her house, and
Mhm.
so the closest she could get was opening her front door and standing in the doorway, and
Mhm.
that was as far as she could get. And that was, but and then it was that baby steps. But everyone is different, and everyone's threshold of stress, of challenges, depending on what's happening in your life, is going to be different. So we might look at someone and go, and then we want to do the hierarchy of grief,
Yeah.
right? Like, well, this happened to me, but this person has it way worse. I don't know if that's a
Right.
woman thing, a Midwest thing, or just a in general thing, but we tend to do that, like, oh, they have it so much worse,
Mhm.
versus then attending to what is actually happening. Vice
Mhm.
versa, if something hasn't impacted me and you can't leave your house, it might be very hard for me to have compassion for you because I'm like, well, get over it already. And so I think that knowing that it's going to be different, even if you've had 10 different grief experiences, and
Mhm.
then now you have an 11th, that's going to be different than all of the other grief experiences
Yeah.
because it's a different relationship, it's a different being or person that has died, and so it's going to impact you. And so I think that's where we say, yes, you can have like a checklist of saying like, okay, this is, these are symptoms. And I think that can be helpful because again, with awareness, and there's some great lists on, but those symptoms are also so vague because it's personal, just like perimenopause or menopause.
Yeah.
It's like really
Yeah.
hard to, but that's where I think if we start having these conversations and
Mhm.
continuing them more often, then we could maybe go like, oh, maybe they're grieving. Or, and I
Mhm.
used to think, and like back in the day, people, of certain faiths would rip or tear their clothing to indicate grief, or
Mhm.
they would wear the black armband, because then it would be like, well, if I'm crying in the middle of the grocery store, someone would be like, what's wrong with that person? But then
Right.
they'd see some indication of, oh, they're grieving.
Yeah.
And I think that if we had some sort of signal,
Mhm.
that we don't have to actually go into it if we don't feel like it, because that, I have a friend who had a really devastating loss recently. And,
Mhm.
she said that, saying it out loud just makes it real. So sometimes we don't want to say I'm grieving. And then we do have that like, oh, well, we should just move on with this, right? And everyone else is moving on. I don't know that I answered your
Mm,
question, but I really think
yeah.
that it's so nuanced,
Right.
that you can look up symptoms. And I would say that when the time to get help would be, if you like are just staying stuck. Like I cannot get out of bed. I cannot get
Mhm.
into the shower. And maybe you're not doing that every day, but kind of
Mhm.
watching for those things because there's, you know, research shows that what helps support grief is social interaction,
Mhm.
social support has to be the right social support.
Yeah.
So in order for it to be helpful, because many people will say, oh, they meant well, right? When they'll do platitudes. And what we often do in grief, we'll say, well, let me know what I can do for you.
Mhm.
And so often people who are grieving don't know what they want. They can't articulate it. They might not know from moment to moment. So, what I say is sit next to someone. You don't even have to say anything.
Mhm.
Or you could say, I'm going to the grocery store. What can I pick up for you? I don't have to come in. I can leave them on the steps for you. So more definitive. Or I'm going to the movie. Would you like to come with? I can come pick you up. So really, so if you're seeing someone, I've kind of now gone into like, how do you support someone who's grieving? But
Yeah.
it is all intertwined.
Ah, you answered my question. I was just
Oh,
gonna say, what do we say? What do we
well,
say? How do we support someone?
and that is the most common question I get. I
Mm,
would do a grief lecture and as a guest speaker at UNR for a lot of people. And so many of the college students would say, how do I support a friend who's grieving? Or what do I do if I'm worried about my mom? And
mhm.
I think that the most powerful thing you can do is show up. The most powerful thing you can do is sit next to you. You're not going to make them more sad. You're
Mhm.
just not, they're already sad. And
Right.
so you could say something like, I would love to hear a story about, like, if you didn't know the person, I'd love to
Right.
hear a story about your dad if you feel up to telling me one. And always have that
Mhm.
caveat if you feel up to it, because if you don't, then they might feel put on the spot and be like, I don't want to talk right now. Or saying, like, if you knew the person, saying, like, oh, I was just thinking about so and so, and this popped into my mind and I had to share it. And it can feel like, oh, do I share it? Do I not share it? But I think that you, the best way to support is to be authentic and say, you know, even say, I don't know what to say, or I'm
Yeah.
afraid I'll say the wrong thing. So I'm just going to sit here and let you guide this.
Right. Right.
And so I think those are the powerful ways to be present and some
Mhm.
of the best gifts that you can give.
I agree with that. And when you were saying those articles are based on, right, the 2 months of
Yeah.
grief, you should be over that. But yet, what they meant is to be actually functioning. I wish that they would make that more clear because think of everyone that, in myself included, that sees that. And then there's another layer of the shame of that I'm not over my grief yet. Why am
Yes.
I not over my
What's
grief yet?
wrong with me?
What's wrong
Yes.
with me? Oh, I'm so, so thankful that you gave us a little insight into
Well, and I
what
had to
that
push
research
back.
is.
I had to
Yeah.
push back when I was doing my dissertation because one of the people on my committee is a very prolific and, amazing grief researcher.
Mm,
But he focuses on that really, I'm blanking on the name, but it's like the medical grief where 10
mhm.
years post a loss, someone is acting that day as if it was the first day they heard about the loss. And
Right.
so there is something in that, again, getting stuck, not because there's that beautiful image, and it came out of a grief focus group where
Mhm.
this woman was talking about the loss of her child, and she said, I thought that my grief would get smaller, and it's indicated as a ball, like in that, so the ball is smaller in the jar, and she goes, but what really is happening is I'm growing around it. And so I
Mhm.
think when we remember that, yes, we are still here, so how can we carry it with us without it, like, that we're not able to engage in the life that we still have.
Right.
And it's not to say, oh, fa la la, I'm glad I'm not with it, that this person's not here, but it's truly, okay, I am here. And how can I
Mhm.
grow with my grief?
Mhm.
So there is that medicalized or chronic or it's a word. Anyways, it's some
Mhm.
research word. But and I had, so again, going back to my dissertation, I had to push back because they wanted me to only talk to people who had lost. My research was on women 50 and older who had recently lost their moms. And I
Mhm.
said recently, like, and I was thinking within a year. And the pushback was, well, no, research bears out that it's 2 months. And I was like, like I'm gonna just want to talk to them. And yes, some of the people weren't in chronic grief or, like in that real throes of it, but they were able to then reflect and say that the loss of and the death of my mom has impacted me in this way, and
Yeah.
it doesn't go away. I mean, it could be a song at Christmas or a
Mhm.
smell or something like that, and to be able to
Mhm.
just acknowledge that while living your life. And so to have compassion for those things or to have rituals that feel supportive. I don't have, like, my grandma and I had nothing butterfly, like it wasn't like oh, we are butterfly people, or oh, I don't know, what are butterfly people, I don't
Mhm.
know. But when I
Mhm.
see these certain like little white butterflies, they might be white or yellow, but they're usually white, and they're just like little, and it'll go across my vision. I'm like, oh, grandma. And I don't know why I've associated that, but that gives me then a warm feeling, right? And so I think
Mhm.
there's that continued bonds of, how do we, one woman was talking about, she had a picture of her dad up, and every night she'd be like, okay, good night, dad. And she'd give, kind of kiss her hand and pat the picture. So I think as the more we learn about how we can continue those bonds or how we can continue that connection, because I think before we were thinking like, well, they've died now, the rest of the life is moving on, but we don't have to. We can find
Yeah.
ways to incorporate them into our lives today. And people are doing beautiful things like at
Oh,
weddings and
yeah, the
in baptisms.
creativity.
Yes, yes. So that would be another thing I would encourage, is that,
Mm.
as you are starting to move and you know live your life around the grief, like, what are
Mhm.
ways to do that?
Absolutely. I love those options. And I think it helps us think about that even when we're in it, those precious moments and things that we could pull out with our loved one at
Yes.
some point, right? If they're no longer with us, we're able to do
Yeah.
that.
And
Yeah.
I do want to caution to,
Yeah.
because we have this wanting to skip to the good part. Like,
Right.
because it's
Right.
uncomfortable to be sad. And it's uncomfortable to, have all those feelings. So some people want to jump to meaning making right away.
Mhm.
And okay, and if that works for you, but I can almost hear in their voices like, okay, they're starting something, but they haven't really kind of grappled with their own,
Yeah.
things, which again, everyone has their own process, but I would caution people to say, like, have the idea, but don't start going like, oh, I
Mhm.
need to start doing this thing, or I need to start a foundation, or I need to do this,
Right.
because your body and your brain are probably not going to be caught up to those desires.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
That's such a great reminder. That's so true. We had talked about some of those techniques in caregiving, but there are so many different ways we can be mindful in our grief. And
Mm.
so I feel like when we do that, it can empower us. So tell us more about that. How do we do that and incorporate it in our daily routine?
Yeah, it is a practice, because, and I had mentioned, my friend who had experienced a loss, which has impacted me. My meditation practice this whole week has been really challenging because the mind is really busy. So I would say that when you're bringing mindfulness into the space of grief, what is the most important thing is like acknowledging without judgment what is
Mm,
actually happening,
mm,
right? So I I caution, because we want, again, you had mentioned we want a tidy linear place. And so,
mhm,
the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who, gave us the stages of grieving, really weren't initially intended for the grieving. And so I think that's also where we want people to hurry up and be done. We're like, okay, so they've had anger,
Mm.
they've had this, now they're at accepting. And it really is a very tangled weave of all of that. So just because you've had anger once doesn't mean you won't again. So I would say that it's moment to moment being aware and offering like a non-judgmental curiosity to what's happening, because you could say like, oh, all I want to do is watch mindless TV. Okay, so I'm choosing to watch mindless TV because that's protective right now. There's this dual process of grief where we are in active grief, but then we can like we need to kind of step out, or that's what, people are saying,
Mm.
I'll go to a movie or something like that. Or maybe it's, I'm doing something functional around the house, but then I see something that reminds me of the person that died. And then I'm in active grief again. So I think it's that moment to moment awareness, not that you can be so aware all the time, but if something's happening, going like, okay, pause, maybe finding your feet, just as you would in care partnering, find your feet and go like, where am I feeling this in my body? So really bringing curiosity to your own experience is
Mm.
is really going to bring you to the present moment, not in your head, because in your head you've got lots of stories. Our brains are beautiful and they're amazing, and they can get us into a bit of a pickle sometimes. So coming back to the body and going like, okay, I can't stop crying. I'm crying. Okay, like what does that feel like in my body? Oh, my heart's beating, my stomach's in knots. Okay. And then again, doing some mindful breaths. You might not be able to, as I just said, you might not be able to sit and do a meditation practice,
Mm.
but do you know Elizabeth Gilbert? So she
I
wrote Eat, Pray, Love.
do. Yeah.
She, when her wife Rhea died, she said for a year, and maybe she still does it, but she would dance her
Mhm.
grief. And so she would do a shuffle on her, however you get music, and whatever song came up, she was like, that's what I'm dancing to. And there is research that shows like, because we get stuck, in our bodies. So like somatic and pain and stress. So if you can move your body, that might be more called for than a stillness, right? Or, going, and if you have access to nature, or like the one woman I mentioned who just opened her door and breathed some air.
Mm.
So I think there's like, it's like what's called for in the moment, but that takes, again, a pause, a curiosity, and an acceptance for what's
Mhm.
happening. Because maybe it is on the couch watching TV. And then you might also go like, oh, well, is that then tipping into depression if you're prone to
Mm.
depression? So, and I think if you do that, and then knowing, and because sometimes it's so hard to call a
Mhm.
friend, it really is, you don't want to
Mhm.
bother someone, or, like it's 3 a.m. or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it's that non-judgmental awareness, bringing curiosity, coming back to the body, saying, this sucks, this hurts, I don't want
Mhm.
this. But also writing a letter. Like one of my practices when I have deep grief is I don't censor myself, and I just write everything. I mean, my letter with my grandma, it was like times that she pissed me off, times that were, like favorite memories, all of, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And of
Mhm.
course, there's something cathartic about handwriting, and, but however people process, but research does show that if you're using pen to paper, there's something in your brain that's doing something different.
Mhm.
So writing a letter to that person about that person, you could have that opportunity, because then you're kind of downloading, but don't limit it to just one way of being. Move your body,
Mhm.
dance your grief, which I just love that phrase, because it's so, I don't know, it's visceral, right? And
Mhm.
we don't often think of dancing and sadness at the same
No,
time.
I love that you brought
Yeah,
that up.
yeah,
And what a way to move the energy through our bodies as we're
yeah.
experiencing everything, right?
Yes,
Because it's like we can
yes.
have two emotions at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
the sadness and the loss, but the joy and all of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I
Yeah.
love that advice.
And so yeah, so that's how bringing mindfulness into grief,
Mm,
and mindfulness into anything really,
right.
right? It's
Yeah.
paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. But it's the judgmentally. And
Mm,
then if you notice yourself being judgmental, don't judge the judging. Like that's next level.
I
That's next level.
know.
But because you could be like, what is wrong with me? No, now you're judging the judging. So like, yes, I'm feeling
Oh,
judgmental about
yeah.
how someone approached me, or I'm feeling judgmental about a platitude that someone gave me.
Mm,
Okay, or I'm feeling angry. And and just kind of saying like all feelings are welcome. Like
yeah.
it is all here. We're
Mm,
meant to be here to experience all the things, but we tend to kind of focus on the quote unquote good ones,
so true.
and when we're in the murky, mucky ones, it can be really hard to
Yeah.
have kindness
Yeah.
for yourself.
Yeah.
So that's where I would
Oh,
start. Yeah.
we needed to hear this today.
Oh,
We
thank you,
did.
Nicole.
So good. And with the community, I think sometimes we know we need the supportive environments. We know we need to talk about it, right? Openly discuss that grief and loss. Um, how do we do that? And have you found any specific like resources or
Mm.
support systems that you recommend as we're navigating all of this grief?
Yes. Again, through awareness, right? So one
Mm.
of my friends, when her mom died, got like she said 5 copies of the same grief book, and she was like, I don't want a book. Like
Right.
I'm at a different place. So
Mhm.
there are amazing books. Megan Devine has how to carry what can't be fixed.
Mm,
And it's okay that you're not okay. Those two
mm,
books are really powerful. The one is a workbook that, actually has things that you can work through. But that is then knowing like what is needed, right? And
mhm.
so that's actually checking in with yourself, because sometimes you don't want to be around people, but
Yeah,
sometimes you might want to be around someone, but only in this specific kind of way.
right.
And being able to articulate that. And I think the more we normalize talking about it, and maybe having, so if you're in a long care journey, you might select a friend and say, hey, Nicole, will you be my person
Mm,
that, and then if it gets too much, will you tell me? And then have, kind of have that lined up. Again, there's sudden and unexpected losses that we're not going to have that, opportunity. But if you're in a long care journey, maybe kind of setting those things up. And if you're talking with the person who's dying, they might not want to talk about it. I mean,
yeah.
there's a new book, Lua Arthur, Briefly Perfectly Human. Oh, she's a death doula, and she is just
Mm,
amazing. I was able to take a training with her through one of the courses I did. Just a powerful woman. And so, but in her book, she also talks about, she went to be, with someone, and they didn't want to talk about it, even though they were like maybe 12 days from their actual death. But she's like, meet people where they are. So that's kind
yeah.
of, it's almost universal. Like, in any situation, can you meet people where they are
Mhm.
with compassion, curiosity, and kindness? Let them lead the discussion. You can't force someone. Like, open the door
Mhm.
and pause.
Mhm.
I have my chosen mom, she's 97. And so, I open the door. I'm like, is there anything you want to talk about or anything? She's like, no, I just take each day as it comes. And she doesn't have anything imminent other than she's
Yeah.
97. But, and so it's like, just, but pausing and saying, I could listen. Or, if your grief is feeling a lot, again, that might be, finding someone that's kind of tangential to the family or to the
Mhm.
situation, so that you could say, I just need to vent, and I might need to sound crappy and, snarky and whatever. And also like letting that be too, because
Right.
sometimes you just need to vent and
Mm.
say like, this is, this sucks.
Yeah.
So again, I don't know if I answered your
You
question, but
did.
I
No, it's
think,
so
yeah,
helpful.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then as another resource, David Kessler,
Mm.
and I can send you links for all these things.
That'd be
He
awesome.
said, he would, how do I say this? He was a co-researcher with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in the day, but he has since, like, he has a free online grief support community that is really quite lovely. And they're
Mm.
pretty, I mean, if someone is being inappropriate, they're pretty quick about that. So
Yeah.
it feels like a very safe space. He'll often have free, opportunities for people to gather virtually.
Mhm.
And he has a book called the step, which is that making meaning step. And again, he said in an interview, I heard him say something like, people will come up and be like, well, when is the purpose and meaning? And he's like, well, when was your loss? And it might be like 3 weeks, 6 weeks. He's like, oh, okay, not yet, or maybe not yet. So there are amazing resources. There's a website called What's Your Grief, and they have a lot of free resources, but they also have paid resources. I used some of their paid resources when I was doing my dissertation. So healthcare providers, or if you're really wanting to like understand different things, they have a lot of great resources.
I thank you for that practical and information that we need. It's so helpful. I think, and when we're in our grief, we don't want to have to think about where do I
Yes.
go for this? I just need someone to tell me some great options. So
Yes. Yes,
thank
that makes
you.
sense. You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Oh, you do so much for this community. You have a podcast,
I
you
do.
have courses, you do all these wonderful things. Tell us more about that. Where can we learn
Thank
of what
you.
you're up to and connect with you?
Oh, I appreciate that. So my podcast is called Creating Connection with Dr. T. You can watch on replays on YouTube. It is also recorded live. So if you're into that, there are links that you can watch live. My website is CC with Dr. T. So creating connection, but just the acronym. So ccwithdrt.com, or you can also find me through TheresaBScore.com. Both will get you to my website. I have free meditation. So if you want to meditate with me on Insight Timer, that is an app that people can, meditate with me. And then I do have different grief groups where I've done webinars, and if you go to my website and sign up for my newsletter, anything that's new would come out from there. So I've done everything from like a 2-hour webinar to, a series of three over, the course of, 3 weeks. And so I don't have anything actively scheduled right now, but I love talking about this. I find, some people will say to me like, "Oh, you're so happy. Like, why do you talk about these topics?" And I'm like, because it's something we all share. And so the connecting of like what makes us human, aging, our bodies, grief, dying, like how can we meet those things that make us human
Mhm.
with compassion, curiosity, and a little bit of ease, and maybe sometimes humor,
Right,
because
right.
come on,
Yeah.
and there are things that aren't funny, but even in those dark
Yeah.
moments, you can find yourself, in the present. You can
Mhm.
find your feet, you can take a
Mhm.
deep breath, and you can reach out to me. I also do one-on-one coaching, so I don't just do groups, but I do one-on-one coaching as well.
Ah, what a gift to be able to meet with you. And you
Oh, thank you
speak
so much.
my language.
I know. I'm
And
so
I
excited to
know,
be
yeah,
connected with
I
you.
know. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
about
thank you.
this today. And I know it can be hard for people to listen to, but you
Mm,
share in such a loving way that I know it's going to be just so received. So thank you for doing that. Thank
thank you,
you.
Nicole. I really appreciate
Yeah,
the opportunity.
my pleasure. My pleasure. Well, we'll do it again.
Yeah, I would love to
We'll
have you on
do it
mine.
again. So yeah, oh my gosh, I love it. Are you looking for more support and community? We sure are. That is why I'm so happy to highlight one of my favorite podcasts in the caregiving community, Confessions of a Reluctant Caregiver, hosted by my friends and sisters Natalie Elliott Handy and JJ Elliott Hill. They offer a unique blend of personal storytelling, expert advice, and candid conversations that shed light on the real life challenges and triumphs that caregivers face. Tune in to Confessions of a Reluctant Caregiver wherever you enjoy your podcasts, or explore more on their website at www.confessionsofareluctantcaregiver.com. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.